Thank you, everyone. I am Michael Miller. I am a student actually at Florida Atlantic University. And what's nice about this is that you guys get a preview of my dissertation that I will be defending on September 2nd. So this is kind of what I will run through. And as you can see, this is a topic about a phenomenological exploration of Jehovah's Witnesses college students' experience with secular higher education. And I tied the theme in, right, with the conference theme to cultic phenomenon and interdisciplinary knowledge, understanding for better interventions. That's what we're going to be discussing with today. So what you will see here is a short, introduction. I'll just sort of go through, exactly. Normally dissertations are 5 chapters. Mine is a little bit longer, so we have 6 chapters. So this is about 6 chapters, and this is a roadmap it's a story of about 17 Jehovah's Witnesses participants, and I'll talk more about them as we go further. Just a little bit about me. I am a non-Jehovah's Witnesses, right? But in full disclosure, I am married to a Jehovah's Witnesses for about a decade. And so you could imagine those dinner conversations, right? Here I am doing research on Jehovah's Witnesses, and she's there. So it kind of goes, then it's tough, right? Because I do have other family members as well. And that's, I think, what birthed this research out of, to try to learn a little bit more about Jehovah's Witnesses and what we can come about with research. Okay, so before we go into it, let me just define a couple things with you, some key terms that I'll be using. So when you think about dogma, right, that is a belief or set of belief that people are expected to accept without any doubts whatsoever, right? And I'll say JW throughout this. That means Jehovah's Witnesses. I'll say THW, which means the Watchtower Society. And that's the governing body that sort of oversees the entire religion within itself, right? And their beliefs are rooted in really, 4 core sources. And you see, I talk about them here, which is the New World Translation, jw.org, the Awake Magazine, and then the Watchtower. Okay. Now that we've, contextualized this, let's go in and look at the background, just some little background so that, because I know that there's some people who don't kind of understand Jehovah's Witnesses, who they are, what they stand for. But I think it was Raymond Colbrenner, and he once says that religion and education have been interrelated since the founding of America. And I bring that quote up because my research focused specifically on the United States, right? I didn't go out and look at other countries, whether Canada, UK, or anything like that. Okay. So Jehovah's Witnesses is a self-identified Christian organization founded in 1897 by Charles Taze Russell. Okay, and it's very important to note that they view higher education with suspicion, framing it as spiritually dangerous. Okay, and I think we all heard Andre's talk earlier. He talked about how difficult it is for education. So they reject college, politics, blood transfusions, and even birthdays. And instead, they emphasize preparing for Armageddon. And that's pretty much, the end of the world prophecy that the end is right around the corner. It can happen any day now. So based on their publications and literature, K through 12 is tolerated, but higher education is strongly discouraged. Okay. So that brings us to some of the problems or the challenges, right? So Jehovah's Witnesses are the least formally educated religious group in the United States, identifying them as virtually invisible, I should say, right? When it comes to being on college campuses, there's really not a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses. People don't identify, hey, I'm a Jehovah's Witnesses on college. They don't do that, okay? And those Jehovah's Witnesses who do attend college, they risk losing everything, right? Such as family, congregation, and even their own salvation, because that's what they're taught, okay? So, and this gap led to my study's purpose, right? And now you'll see the purpose of my study, right? Which is a phenomenological study which explores how Jehovah's Witnesses college students make meaning of their academic, social, and spiritual engagement while enrolled in secular higher education. So there's always 3 lenses that I'm always looking at: the academic side, the social side, and the spiritual side. Okay, so my research is driven on these 3 questions right here. So the first question is really looking at the resolve of what they learn between secular education and then the Jehovah's Witnesses dogma. The second question is their affiliation, right? And how does the affiliation affect their academic, social, and the spiritual involvement? And the third question is strategically, how did they use to manage, right, their academic, social, and spiritual responsibilities while in college? All right. So every research, there is significance, right? Like, why does this matter, right? Right. What do we hope to provide to Jehovah's Witnesses college students as well as college administrations? And because JW college students walk a lonely and often unsupported path, and yet they persist, especially the 17 participants, and you'll hear their stories in a minute. They went to college, right? When they're taught, they went against the grain. You cannot go to college, and they actually went to college. So this is very interesting to me. So all this was shaped by the conceptual framework of Baxter Magolda's self-authorship theory, right? And so to understand the Jehovah's Witnesses college students' development, I used Magolda's theory of self-authorship, which essentially outlines how individuals seek to own their own experiences and eventually become the author of their own lives. So the theory unfolds in 4 phases. Right. The first phase is following formula, right? So young people following formulas that others have provided, right? Jehovah's Witnesses, they follow in whatever the Watchtower has dictated to them, right? The second is the crossroads, right? Adolescence begins to have doubts about what they're being taught, okay? Next is becoming the author of one's life, and that consists of the ability to choose one's belief and make their own decision. And then fourth is establishing an internal foundation, becoming grounded in who you are, making those wise decisions for yourself and not relying on someone else to make the decisions for you. Pardon me. So I chose this framework because the model, it really illuminates how rigid the Watchtower dogmas suppress autonomy, right? They don't want you to advance past the ball and formless stage. They want you stuck in that phase right there. Yeah. So let's look a little bit at what the literature said. Okay. The literature on Jehovah's Witnesses in higher education breaks down into 3 buckets. Okay. So the first literature is the Watchtower's own publication. And if we all know anything about that, it's non-peer review. It's whatever they write, that is what they have to believe. Okay. The second set of literature is what former Jehovah's Witnesses have written. And yes, some may have some sort of biasness to it, because some people may be upset, oh, that religion just ruined my life. I don't want anything. So their research or literature may be somewhat biased. And the third group is what the scholars have written. And included in that scholarly group, right, is you have former Jehovah's Witnesses who have come out and become scholars and led their voice. And to me, I think that's like the most important voice that you want to hear, right? Because you're listening to their lived experiences. So I think that's essential to learn. And from these emerged several themes as I was going through the literature. A couple things came up, right? Like the early leadership of the Jehovah's Witnesses, the doctrinal control. I heard about the educational discouragement, and yes, there was cultic behavior and patterns. And more, I'll discuss more on that in one moment. Then we have to go through, and I used a qualitative approach to explore how the 17 participants make meaning of their lived experiences, right? And so their stories is going to center basically this research, okay? And so to further understand the meaning of making process, I specifically chose a phenomenological approach because this study is about how Jehovah's Witnesses college students experience and interpret their academic, social, and spiritual journeys in secular higher education. The phenomenological approach allowed me to center their voices because I didn't want my voices to come out. I want their voices to come out, right? To understand how they make sense, right, of the struggles, of the tensions between their educational pursuit and the Jehovah's Witnesses dogmas that pretty much control their lives up until they've gone to college. Okay, so the sample size. The process started with identifying 17 qualified participants. And now this was from a pool of 53 participants. If anyone knows about the Jehovah's Witnesses, it's a very secretive group. And the fact that they spoke to someone, right, about higher education, who's a non-Jehovah's Witnesses is huge. Okay. So the participants consisted of 11 females no, I'm sorry, 11 males and 6 females. Okay. The criteria for participation in the study included the following, right? Self-identified, baptized Jehovah's Witnesses, right? 18-year-old or older, current or former college students. And I put a cap on that, by the way. I want to make a note of that. It was only 10 years. So if someone was out of college for 11 years, I didn't use them. I specifically stayed within the 10-year mark. And then active Jehovah's Witnesses member. And the distinction there with active, meaning that they were, going to door, knocking on the door, participating in those meetings on Saturdays and Sundays and so on and so forth. So the study employed a purposeful sampling and intentionally selected Jehovah's Witnesses college students who could provide rich, relevant insights aligned with the research questions, because I want to make sure of that. Okay. By applying explicit inclusion and exclusion criteria, the technique ensured the recruitment of participants whose lived experiences would meaningfully contribute to the understanding of how Jehovah's Witnesses students navigate secular higher education. And then lastly, in terms of the sample recruit, I used 4 criteria, and that was a social media, direct email. I even used some people here. I reached out to some people here. I don't know if I used anyone. And then I met, actually, believe this or not, 2 Jehovah's Witnesses elders. But I want to be very clear about this study. So my study is not about Jehovah's Witnesses, religion, and what they believe. It's really about their higher education experience. And so I think that's what made it easier for me to grab on to 17 participants because, and as I started to talk to them and build rapport, they were opening more doors to me about their religion. You see? So, all right. So the data collection. Right, so I wanted to enrich my understanding, right, of the doctrinal and cultural messaging that frames Jehovah's Witnesses, right, stance on higher education. So I reviewed basically, I'm tons of literature. You guys have no idea. They have a lot of stuff on their website. That's all I got to tell you. and then with that, right, I did 2 in-depth, semi-structured interviews which followed a modified version of Erwin Seidman. So Erwin Seidman created a three interview process. So I modified that and only used 2. And the first interview focused on the early childhood, right, including like K through 12, because I wanted to see what their experiences was like. Did they gear up to go to college, or was it just, I'm going to wake up one day and go to college, right? I wanted to sort of understand that dynamics. And then the second interview, that focused on their higher education experience. So that was the 2 interviews. And those interviews were conducted through Zoom, transcribed verbatim, with each lasting approximately 40 to 60 minutes. And I just want to back up just one thing before I say the last sentence here. What was very interesting, I'll say the last sentence and then I want to make a note on that. All right. So the participants were given pseudonyms to protect them because it's very careful that protect them. So before I started this, I had 2 pilot interviews, and both people said to me, "Sure, Mike, I'd love to participate in your study. However, we can't see you. All we can hear is your voice." Oh my God, this is going to kill my study. If this is, no one's going to believe it. It wasn't going to be valid. And so that was a challenge, right? So I had to go back, right, and discuss that with my advisor to say, hey, maybe I'm running into a problem. And she said, Mike, don't worry about it. See what happens. And in these 17 did not have a problem. So I was like, but I was nervous about that at the beginning. I must tell you guys. Okay, so after I got all the data, right, I had to analyze that data, right? And so I copied Mustakas, right? He has literally 6 steps, right? That's essential with phenomenological research. And so I modified it, which I'm good at modifying, right? And I used 5 steps instead of 6, right? So the first thing I did, I did the data collection, reviewed and transcribed to ensure accurate representation because I wanted their voices, right? And I had to bracket myself out of this, make sure if I had any bias, it was removed. That was the one thing that I wanted, right? Then I performed an inducive and comparative analysis, including de-identifying anything, right, that would identify any of the participants. And I had to be very careful because there's a few of them you could have known who they were. So I had to really work hard at that, right? And then I used the qualitative analysis software, which is Max QDA, which is fantastic, by the way. It was made life easy for search, and I have so much data. I'll be writing paper for years. Trust me, it's a lot of data, right? Next, during the cycle, I used a values coding to identify the participants' values, beliefs, and their worldview, how they saw things. Step 4, I sorted the codes that were identified into categories to establish an initial analytic framework leading to the second cycle, which is axial, to redefine and reorganize the codes highlighting dominant themes. And the number that I actually got originally was about 128 themes, and I had to really condense all of them down. And then finally, I synthesized emergent themes into a comprehensive textual description of participants' experiences. And the key is all while engaged in what Johnny Saldana called it reflexive memoing, right? Again, taking a step back, making sure that I wasn't interjecting my personal bias into any of this. Because if it did, it would go into the trustworthiness, right? And this is essential when you're doing academic research. It has to be very trustworthy. And all this, by the way, when it comes to, and I won't go into too much here, but when it go into all this, it has to be approved by Florida Atlantic University Institutional Review Board. They have to approve all of this, and those check marks, they approved of all of that before I can go to the next level. Or else I would have been in trouble. They would have been like, nope, this is not good. So that's where that comes from. All right, so every study, there's limitations and delimitations, right? From my study, there's it's limited available literature on Jehovah's Witnesses. There's not a lot out there, especially when it comes to higher education and Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm probably the first person who's doing any research on this, right? The generalizability challenge, there's only 17, right? So we can't say this is all Jehovah's Witnesses. There's about 9 million, okay, worldwide. I only do 17. My sample size is small, it's 17, and I only focused on Jehovah's Witnesses. So I excluded whether it be elders, sisters, brothers, all that other stuff, right? And again, the delimitations, I struggled with that. So I turned to the scholar. I turned to a guy named Anthony Miles, who defined delimitation as chiefly concerned with the scope of the study, right? And so with that being said, the 4 delimitations had self-imposed restrictions that I made up, right? And in my case, they mirrored the sample criteria, the 4 sample criteria. Okay, this is a comprehensive list just so you can see of the participants' demographics. So if you notice in which column, the religious affiliation column, right, there's 6 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 highlighted in red, right? Those are still active Jehovah's Witnesses, right? So you can see the sort of status, even after we met and all that. So today they're probably still active Jehovah's Witnesses. The other key thing I want to point out, Emily, never baptized, which I thought was interesting. But Emily lived as a Jehovah's Witnesses. That's why it was essential to have her in the study. And then out of all 17, only 2 were baptized as adults. Volvo and Geek. We're in Geek 21. So 21 and 24. The rest, all children that they were baptized. You guys look at that for a minute. That's kind of good. All right. So now let's go into the doubts. So this was very interesting. So there was 2 participants stated that they had no doubts at all about the Jehovah's Witnesses. There was no doubts in their mind. This was the truth. This was it for them, right? So notably, a third of all participants experienced doubt, right? 1 as early as middle school, as you saw there, and most of them during college. And then on the right-hand side, you can see those were some of the influences that contributed to the participants doubting. Okay. Now we'll get to the meat of the research. Right, I'm doing good on time. Okay. So this is the findings, right? So what I tried to do with the findings, there's 3 findings, and I really tried to gauge them with each question. Okay. So finding 1, research question 1, finding 2, research question 2, and 3, and so on and so forth. Okay. And from that, the 3 themes. All right, so let's go into, I'll try to go through this really quickly here, right? But this is actually fun stuff. This is good stuff. So let's go on theme 1, right? So participants describe compartmentalizing, right? Separating academic knowledge from religious beliefs to avoid cognitive dissonance. So here's what Geek had to say. I was very good at compartmentalizing because I believed everything that we were learning in the JW meetings, but I didn't really let that affect me academically. Right? It's very interesting, right? So some participants, right, also use mental that included reinterpreting secular education content to align with the Watchtower's dogma, right? Selectively engaging with information that felt less threatening and leaning on internal reasoning to justify their multiple commitments. And for example, I had Anna, Iffy, and Geek, right? Who they substituted terms like natural selection with Jehovah's plan, which allowed them to associate the idea, right? There was an idea, right, with the Watchtower dogmas and make them feel less threatening. It was just easier for them. So that's why they ended up doing that. All right. Then we'll go. So that was the academic. So now we'll go to the social, right, for question number one, right? A lot of them distancing themselves, okay? There was a clear distinction between us and everyone talked about it today and the worldly folks, right? It's us against them, right? And you had that. And then and some of them used talking with Jehovah's Witnesses, non-Jehovah's Witnesses parents or professors or professional to kind of help them to try to understand some of the dynamics that they were going through, right? And here's what Morris had to say. For the first time while he was in college, right, I felt like my questions weren't a threat, but an opportunity to grow. So Morris started to get it a little bit. He was trying to say, college is different than when I go to the Kingdom Hall. I'm not asking questions in Kingdom Hall. Why not, right? Now, Kay was very interesting. So Kay, he struggled socially, right? And he spent time in a mental institution because when he was younger, he tried to commit suicide, right? And he said, my brother saw what was happening and he told me, there's nothing wrong with you. You have my support. So that was powerful for him. And that led him to say, you know what? I could remove myself from this group. I can get away from this. All right, now let's look at the spiritual side, right? So a lot of them prioritized the Watchtower Society, right? With Anna stating, right, when she was younger, right, the core fire inside of me was being a Jehovah's Witnesses, putting Jehovah first. That was her mission, right? Education meant nothing for her, right? But then as she got older, look what she did. She started to play on her own rules. Oh, these were Jehovah's Witnesses' stupid rules. Why am I following those rules for, right? She just became wise out of that, right? And some of them just got completely silenced. They weren't even talking to anyone or didn't want anyone to know that they were Jehovah's Witnesses like Geek. And she said, I was a closeted Jehovah's Witnesses in my academic world. My classmates and professors didn't know about my belief because I thought they'd see me as weird or closed-minded. And then there was others that were just outward rebels. They were just like, forget this Jehovah's Witnesses stuff, right? They realized they were really essentially lies that were being told to them. And this was James. And James is a very interesting character. James, Jehovah's Witnesses, married 2 children, went to because it was a Baptist college or something like that at nights without his wife even knowing. It's just remarkable, you know? All right, so finding number 2 academically, right? Participants prioritize Jehovah's Witnesses' responsibilities over their coursework, right? With Jack stating, we had 3, they called it 5 meetings a week, Tuesday night, Thursday night, Saturday morning for service, and Sunday morning another meeting. So you can see Jack just said they just kept us busy all the time, but they didn't want us to focus on our schoolwork. They kept us busy, okay? The Watchtower Society's dogma shaped participants' decision, right? Avoiding courses on evolution or politics. Economically, some face financial strain after rejecting career paths deemed worldly by the Watchtower, right? So when you look at decision making, right, that was Bryn. Bryn said, they told her all the time that education was secondary education is bad, right? When it came to selecting their courses, here's what Jack said. If, he felt a sense of betrayal while attending mandatory, right, religious studies courses because he was going against Jehovah while he's in these religious course classes, right? And then career decision, when he had to choose, right? Here's what Elias said. I chose my career based on the guidelines of my religion, trying to make it, the Watchtower Society dogmas fit. And then economic consequences. I loved what Lewis had to say. He said, serving Jehovah and being broke. He was like, man, I'm always broke all the time. I had no money as a Jehovah's Witnesses. So I thought that was kind of neat. All right. So the social, question number 2, right? Isolation and loneliness were pervasive. It ran rampant due to restrictions on extracurricular activities and non-Jehovah's Witnesses. And So Brent stated, I was totally isolated because I didn't feel comfortable enough to have non-Jehovah's Witnesses friends in college due to the idea of bad association. And once Elliot started, and this is interesting, right? Because Elliot now, right, he started to date a non-Jehovah's Witnesses, and this is what he said, right? I noticed my JW friends distancing themselves from me once he started to date someone on the outside world. All right, spiritually, I'm kind of going through this fast now. But let's see, I'm rushing out of time here. I think I got like 10 minutes left. All right. Oh, good. Okay. So this is theme 3, spiritually. Okay, participants reported they were affected both positively and negatively. And I won't go through all that. I'll just kind of let you guys look at that. But you can see some of the things that impact them positively, like diversity, critical thinking that was positive, right? There's a community, they felt a bondage, right? And then the negative side, right? The challenge, they felt like college challenged their dogma, right? Time management. They didn't know which was more important, right? Peer pressure. Hey, I hope you're not going to that college thing, right? And then fear of if you go to college, you know what might happen to you. Armageddon might come up, all these things that sort of happened there. All right. So now we're in theme 3, academic, right? Where participants set intellectual boundaries such as avoiding debates on conflicting topics, right? And Daniel, it was interesting what Daniel says, right? The Jehovah's Witnesses, they emphasize that their training in the Bible and their doctrines is the best education you can get. So he was like, well, why am I going to college if I could get it all from the JW, right? Why would I do that, right? Then there was some conflicting content, right? Which many aspects of Jehovah's Witnesses doctrine conflict with common sense in real life. And Jack was very practical. I still don't understand what, and believe it or not, Jack to this day is still a Jehovah's Witnesses, but he was very practical. He got what was happening, but it's like, Mike, this is my family. This is all I know. He was one that was born into it, and he couldn't get out of it, I guess. All right, now we go to the socially. So participants practice selective socialization, maintaining JW networks by cautiously building collegiate peers connection on campus, right? And so that was that whole selective. So who do I want to hang around with, right? And this was also interesting, like Al, a commuter, right? Usually Jehovah's Witnesses don't even commute to college. So, that was sort of interesting. Well, I should say they do commute to college, but not if they what do you say, a little stay in a roommate situation when you're in college. They don't live on campus, right? So he would commute. And he says, I didn't really develop social relationships outside. And again, worldly or bad association was very much dependent on the Watchtower organization and the congregation for all the social stuff. Okay. Then they prioritized the social activities, right? This was key. And this is Volvo. Now, Volvo was one of the ones that did not. First of all, he was an adult when he got baptized, right? And he had no doubts whatsoever. And here's what he said: I did not have that much contact with the other students because some were into heavy drinking or doing drugs or something. And I had always a feeling, right? A feeling, right? Not no proof, a feeling, right? That the commonalities were missing. So we did not bond. I did something with the JW brothers or sisters. So he just avoided altogether. Okay, spiritually in there. They use daily rituals, right, like prayer and scripture study to help reinforce the Watchtower dogmas. Through some relied on JW elders, family, and friends for emotional support. So daily rituals, right? And here's what Morris had to say: no matter how stressful school got, he knew, right, that the Kingdom Hall meetings were non-negotiable. He had to do that, right? That was the time to refocus, be reminded of what matters, and stay connected to Jehovah. So that was the most important thing, right? And some of them tried to leverage their JW community. And Kay said, right, it was always focused on the ministry, focus on serving Jehovah, focus on Bethel. And Bethel is sort of upstate New York over there, John, right? Right? Is their headquarters. And instead of it's in Warwick, okay, but instead of going to college, you train to sort of go to Bethel. All right, so there was some things that jumped out, right? That was consistent with the literature. And I thought that was very interesting, right? So we talked about Armageddon a little bit, the end of the end of prophecy or whatever. And so he now got what Kay said here. So school was just a means to an end. The most important thing was making sure that you were in good spiritual standing with Jehovah so that during Armageddon, you would not be destroyed, right? Perfect. Okay. And then their stance in higher education. Here's what Bryn says. My elders warned that professors would try to reshape my thinking, and it made me paranoid about every lecture. And then Holiday was very interesting. I think Lois might have been like in third grade or something like that. And of course, he had a piece of ice cream cake at a birthday party. And then he said, I asked my mom, if what I did was wrong. So the poor kid was paranoid. He didn't know, right? And a blood transfusion. Now, Geek, who was in the medical profession giving advice to a young lady, she said, so what happens if we pass away tomorrow and 2 days later, the Watchtower Society, all right, say that blood transfusions are okay? Okay. And these are some unique challenges, again, that I came across. Right, and I'm just because I'm running with time, so I'm gonna kind of not go through all of them, but you can kind of see I highlighted stuff like mental health, how they talked about that, political, government neutrality, and critical thinking and decision making. Then another one, the theme that came up was Dr. Hassan's bite model here. You can see what some of them talk about when they say behavior, right? Control, right? They're teaching everything iffy. They're teaching everything I'm learning in school. Behavior, relationship, right? With people, how we interact with people. Why am I going to school if I can learn it all in the Kingdom Hall, right? Information. And I like what, who said, this was Jack said, right? If someone saw me reading about evolution or philosophy, they'll think I was losing my faith, So it's like, only read our information. Okay, and the other two I'll just skip again for time. And then now self-authorship. This is sort of interesting because, right, so I tied back the research to the theoretical framework. So all 17 participants fell into the formula phase, right, which is where they're supposed to be. But 15 participants had doubt. Now, what I realized in the crossroad phase, there are 3 stages. There's the early stage, the middle phase, and then the end phase, right? So I'd say from the 15, and there was only 4 that actually went over into the self-authorship. Remember the last chart I showed you before? There were 6, right? So 6 are still in it. That kind of like, are they really in it, right? So there's, and so 4 is really sort of making their own decision now. And eventually none of the participants was in the internal foundation in that section there. All right, unique to literature. I'm going to skip this. This is just, again, academic, social, spiritual, and some global relevance in terms of what this research can do. So this is now recommendations that I am actually recommended, okay, for higher education institution. Maybe create some sort of counseling center that could help all the participants in my study. The 6 female participants had experience with sexual abuse. Fear, let these counsel center understand about fears and shunning and disfellowship and what it means to help, because they don't know at the higher education institution level, and build academic and career advising to help these student affairs professional and faculty understand where the Jehovah's Witnesses students are coming from, because a lot of people just don't know. Then for the Watchtower, and this is tough, right? How do you adopt a model of supporting system, right? And this is what Al said here, right? Even if the Jehovah's Witnesses can kind of just change their mindset, I think they would probably keep more people. If they don't have this hard stance against higher education, they would probably get more people to stay in it. If you really truly think about it, right? I mean, look what Al said here. Having support to pursue education in a vocational field would have meant financial security and less spiritual guilt. So all the time, he's feeling guilty all the time. Look at it. That means my time is up here. 7 minutes. Oh, and stuff. Okay, and then these are my recommendations for Jehovah's Witnesses students. Right. The first one is really and truly just build some time management. And here's what Geek had to say. There were weeks when I barely slept. I'd be out in service, right? Then rush to class, then study late at night. It was exhausting trying to do both. So really and truly, if they can find a way to do both, they should be able to the Jehovah's Witnesses shouldn't put a lot of pressure on them to not get an education. And second thing is, build relationships, which is what they want, right? When you go to college, you want to build long-lasting friendships. You're supposed to do this, right? And here's what Geek had to say. I think throughout my whole entire childhood, I never felt like I belonged either with the Jehovah's Witnesses or with the worldly people. Imagine, that sort of life, not knowing where you belong in this world, that world. You're kind of, that must have been really tough for her. And by the way, I'm probably going to write an article on this one, a paper on that one, because that was just, I really like that quote. And then third is, because they're taught about Armageddon, they should set long-term career goals, right? And here's what Kay said: the world is controlled by Satan, and this is what they told her, right? That the world's controlled by Satan, and the JW elders kept reminding me about the spiritual dangers of attending college looking for a career. Got it. And in the strength of my study, diversity and representative of the participants sample, it was a strong sample. Like I said, 11 male, 6 female. The education level came from high school all the way up to doctoral. So it was a very diverse group. And 2 was the access to the participants. And it was trust building. Again, being Jehovah's Witnesses, trusting a non-Jehovah's Witnesses with this information, that was huge. That was tremendous. So recommendations for future research, comparative study, maybe look at some other groups, right? The LDS, Mormons, Seven-Day Adventures, see what they're doing, right? Because those 2 who specifically, they encourage higher education. So why not the Jehovah's Witnesses? Think about that too, right? Longitudinal studies. Well, this is what Baxter McGolder did, right? Track their studies, right? After they get out of college. Are they still Jehovah's Witnesses? Who knows, right? Just look at that. And then find some sort of support structure for students of higher control religions. Try to find something that can help them assimilate while they're on these college campuses. And, Jehovah's Witnesses students are not simply survivors of constraint. They are authors of possibilities. And I think that might be it. And I want to thank my group. And before I end, I want to thank my wonderful niece here, by the way, who came all the way from Toronto, who came to videotape me and support me. And she's been a huge support. So thank you. Thank you all for